Coming up, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, and George Pullman hired them. A titan of industry, Pullman built his name on the Pullman sleeping car. On board, you were treated like royalty. He even built an entire town and named it after himself. His vision? Capitalism helping labor, while labor helps capitalism. But when Pullman's business suffered, workers' wages suffered too, and they revolted. Rail equipment was tipped over. Trains were set on fire. People lost their lives. It became one of the most powerful examples of the U.S. military being used to crush a labor union. Yet at the same time, black Pullman workers were preparing for an even bigger fight. Black people make a way where there is no way, leaving an indelible mark on American history. Without the brotherhood of sleeping car porters, there likely would be no modern civil rights movement. This is Pullman and the Railroad Rebellion, next on Chicago Stories. Support for Chicago Stories is provided by the Nigorny Foundation. Major support comes from the Elizabeth Morse Genius Charitable Trust, the Tawani Foundation on behalf of the Pritzker Military Museum and Library, and the Donna Van Eekeren Foundation. Funding for Chicago Stories, Pullman and the Railroad Rebellion is provided by K. Ed Philippi and Renee Alphons, and Antonio and Kimberly Monk. This hat, when I look at it today, I get chills down my arms. My dad was a very classy man. He cherished the uniform of the Pullman porter. It represented being able to rise above segregation, to earn respect. That's the word, respect. When someone sees that you are well-trained, well-spoken, and well-dressed, that goes a long way. That's what this hat meant. The Pullman porters rode the rails in crisp suits, polished shoes, and welcoming smiles, offering luxury with a personal touch. But behind those uniforms were stories of hardship and struggle. Because in this gilded age, not everything that glittered was gold. Chicago in the late 1800s was booming. Hundreds of thousands of people poured into the city searching for work and a fresh start. It was the fastest growing city in the world, certainly in the United States. The stockyards were here. The steel mills were here. The railroads converged here. Chicago was an economic engine exploding with opportunity. For a 26-year-old civil engineer named George Pullman, it was fertile ground. Pullman grew up in New York and got into the business of moving buildings for the Erie Canal. That trade brought him to Chicago at just the right time. Back then, the city was practically a swamp, mud in the streets deep enough to drown a horse. Pullman was hired to lift multi-story buildings several feet above a new sewer system, sometimes while people were still inside. He quickly made a name for himself as a shrewd, sincere, hard-working businessman. People believed in him. By 1860, 11 rail lines crossed through Chicago. If you wanted to capitalize on rail and transportation, this was the place to do it. Pullman seized the moment. He became fascinated with improving both rail efficiency and passenger comfort. Overnight rail travel at the time was cramped and miserable. So he came up with an idea, a car that functioned as a day coach during daylight hours, but converted into sleeping berths at night. Inspired by the luxury hotels of the era, Pullman believed that if he could bring a high-end hotel experience onto the rails, complete with exceptional service, he could corner the market. In 1858, at just 27 years old, George Pullman launched what would become the Pullman Palace Car Company. The cars were stunning. Polished wood interiors. Deep, luxurious carpeting. Gas lamps and lanterns glowing warmly overhead. Everything about the space told passengers they were in a plush hotel on wheels. Pullman leased these cars to railroads and marketed them as luxury for the middle class. Well into the 20th century, the company's logo highlighted what was perhaps its greatest asset, the black porter. On a Pullman car, you were treated like royalty. Porters handled everything, delivering fresh linens, using special berth keys to transform seats into sleeping beds, tending to passengers' needs day and night. On some trains, especially deluxe cross-country routes, there was also a Pullman maid. She greeted women passengers and their children, helped them settle in, cared for the children, offered manicures, styled hair, and assisted with dressing. But maids were far less common, usually only one per train. After the Civil War, George Pullman hired recently freed slaves and their descendants to serve on his sleeping cars. Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, and George Pullman hired them. Pullman believed formerly enslaved people would make the most deferential porters. That assumption deeply shaped how passengers viewed and interacted with them, rooted in antebellum racial attitudes that persisted even after slavery ended. While the rigid Jim Crow system of the South did not fully exist in Chicago, limits still defined how far black workers could go. In 1865, after Abraham Lincoln's assassination, a train carried his body from Washington, D.C., to Springfield, Illinois. A Pullman sleeping car provided comfortable quarters for dignitaries following the funeral procession. The publicity was enormous. National attention turned toward the beautiful cars Pullman had designed. Orders poured in. By 1879, the company had 464 cars in service and gross annual earnings of $2.2 million, more than $65 million in today's money. As production expanded, so did the workforce. Draftsmen, carpenters, painters, and factory laborers, most of them Southern and Eastern European immigrants, filled Pullman's shops. But factory work demanded long hours. There were no days off. Railroad captains of industry were treated like demigods. Wealth became concentrated at the very top, while workers, the people creating that wealth, lived in dangerous conditions and overcrowded housing, with little political power and few protections. Pullman insisted he did as much for labor as any man alive. He claimed he treated his workers fairly, and in return, he expected loyalty. Like other industrialists of his time, he understood that keeping workers alive and coming back to work mattered. Maybe pay them just enough so they return. Maybe don't let conditions become so deadly that disease or injury wipes out the workforce. Because in the end, the system depended on them coming back. And soon, those workers would demand far more than survival. In 1880, George Pullman bought 4,000 acres of land just south of Chicago and created something ambitious, a company town where his white employees could both live and work. He named it Pullman. His hope was simple, at least in theory: capitalism helping labor, while labor helps capitalism. Pullman envisioned a kind of capitalist utopia, a self-contained community where everything a worker might need, from housing to groceries to services, existed within the town's borders. Officially, the company placed no racial restrictions on who could live in Pullman. But realistically, society did. The majority of the manufacturing workforce was white, and they made up most of the town's residents. Meanwhile, the black porters and maids typically lived closer to the rail lines, in neighborhoods like Bronzeville. Pullman built comfortable, even luxurious homes for the time. Workers rented them directly from the company. For many, it seemed like a real opportunity to improve their lives. Behind me, for example, are the row houses built for skilled workers and managers. These homes had indoor running water, something unusual except for the well-to-do. They also had gas lighting. Streets were washed daily. Trash was picked up regularly. Compared to the crowded, unsanitary conditions many workers had previously endured, this felt like a major uplift. It wasn't just good for workers, it was good for business. It was Pullman's town. He collected the rent. He grew and sold the food. The shopping center, the arcade, generated profit. Even church buildings required rent. Every dollar circulated back into company coffers. For the first 13 years, the system ran like a well-oiled machine. At its peak, the town of Pullman housed about 12,000 workers and their families. But Pullman's control extended far beyond housing. From the books in the library to the goods in the grocery store, his influence touched nearly every aspect of daily life. On the surface, everything was clean, orderly, beautiful. Visitors from outside saw what looked like an ideal community. But a town built in a man's own name isn't just about philanthropy, it's about control. It's about making workers dependent and expecting total loyalty in return. Behind the brick facades, trouble was brewing. By late 1893, 13 years after the town was founded, a severe financial panic had gripped the nation. The economic downturn hit hard, and George Pullman felt it. Orders for new railcars dried up. Pullman began laying off workers, in huge numbers. He was in a tight position. He had promised investors a guaranteed 6% net profit every year. To protect that bottom line, he slashed workers' wages by 25%. But rent? Rent stayed the same. Think about that today. Would a landlord reduce rent during an economic depression? No. The difference in Pullman's case was that the company was both the employer and the landlord. Meanwhile, George Pullman and his family continued enjoying the height of Gilded Age luxury in their custom-built Prairie Avenue mansion, staffed by more than a dozen servants. These industrialists, men with money practically falling out of their pockets, chose to recover their financial losses on the backs of their workforce. There's a surviving paycheck from one worker, 2 weeks of labor, and after rent was deducted, just 12 cents remained. 12 cents. The situation was unbearable. When a committee of workers tried to meet with Pullman to discuss preserving wages and jobs, he refused. He took offense at their demands and turned his back on them. With a stubborn employer and no labor laws to protect them, workers' grievances went unheard. So in May 1894, 4,000 workers walked off the job. The very next day, May 11, 1894, Pullman had one of the company bands playing publicly, projecting an image of normalcy, as if nothing was wrong. But production stopped. Pullman cars were no longer being built. Still, the company insisted it remained unaffected, and George Pullman refused arbitration. Many in Chicago believed Pullman was being rigid, that he should be listening to his workers instead of dismissing them. But it was his way or the highway. The workers realized that to truly pressure Pullman, they needed national attention. So they turned to a powerful ally, the American Railway Union, ARU, the largest labor organization in the country. Its leader was 38-year-old Eugene V. Debs of Toyote, Indiana, a charismatic speaker who deeply believed in worker solidarity. Debs saw Pullman as the embodiment of an oppressive capitalist class, one that could only survive by exploiting labor. He had been building a strong railroad union, and hundreds of Pullman workers began joining the ARU. 1 month into the strike, the ARU held its national convention in Chicago. Several Pullman workers, now members, pleaded for support. Among them was Jenny Curtis, a seamstress for the Pullman Company who sewed curtains and carpets for the railcars. Her father, also a Pullman worker, had recently died. At the time of his death, they owed the company about $60 in rent. She later recalled that when she couldn't pay, bank clerks hurled insults at her. Mr. Pullman, she said, did not pay her enough for her hard labor to cover rent and survive. Jenny delivered what many consider one of the most important speeches in American labor history. She addressed the convention, "Mr. President and brothers of the American Railway Union, we joined the ARU because it gave us a glimmer of hope. Pullman, both the man and the town, is an ulcer on the body politic. It will go on forever unless you, the American Railway Union, stop it, end it, crush it out. So I say, come along with us for decent conditions everywhere." Her words electrified the room. 600 delegates voted to support the strike, launching a national boycott of Pullman railcars. Railroad workers across the country refused to handle any train carrying a Pullman car. Anything attached to a railroad track was effectively frozen. Switchmen in the yards refused to cross the line in solidarity. What began as a small, local labor dispute exploded into a national movement. The boycott involved 250,000 workers nationwide, the largest sympathy strike in American history at that time. Within 2 months, the ARU had effectively paralyzed rail travel on 29 railroads across the United States. Even commuter lines within cities stopped. Produce rotted in fields and boxcars. The nation's economic engine ground to a halt. Debs fueled the movement at rallies, openly attacking Pullman. "I believe a rich plunderer like Pullman is a greater felon than a poor thief. It is our duty to strip the mask of hypocrisy from this pretended philanthropist and show him to the world as an oppressor of labor. You are striking to avert slavery and degradation." There was a bitter irony in Debs' words. African Americans were excluded from the ARU. Black railroad workers were barred by a color line and could not join the union. That meant the Pullman porters were not part of the strike. Their voices were not included. Their grievances were not part of the collective protest. The white railroad workers had voted to keep black workers out. At first, the strike remained peaceful, though massively disruptive. But George Pullman and other railroad tycoons were desperate to get the trains moving again. And the next phase would change American labor history forever. The General Managers Association was a powerful coalition made up of 24 of the biggest railroad operators in Chicago. Many of them were close associates, even lunch buddies, of George Mortimer Pullman. They believed the strike had gone too far, and that something had to be done. So they acted. They hired strikebreakers. They attacked Eugene Debs in the press. Their words further enraged the Pullman workers and their supporters. In the South Chicago rail yards, tensions boiled over. Protesters retaliated. Rail equipment was tipped over. Train cars were set on fire. The General Managers Association seized the opportunity. They arranged for U.S. mail cars to be attached to trains that included Pullman cars. Suddenly, if those trains were blocked, the United States mail would stop moving. And that was exactly what the association wanted. They accused Debs and the American Railway Union of interfering with interstate commerce and obstructing the mail, serious federal offenses. That accusation forced the federal government to step in. Pullman had powerful friends. President Grover Cleveland was listening closely to major employers and responding to their demands. The U.S. Attorney General filed an injunction declaring the strike illegal. Pullman's influence in Washington helped generate a swift and favorable response. On July 4, 1894, thousands of federal troops began arriving in Chicago and in the town of Pullman. Once the troops showed up, a situation that had not been violent spiraled out of control. In the South Chicago rail yards, an angry mob overturned train cars and set them ablaze. Federal troops opened fire. People lost their lives. It became one of the most striking examples in the 19th century of the U.S. military being used to crush a labor union. When it was over, dozens were dead. Thousands were injured. Hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of property had been destroyed. And no one truly won. The railroads lost millions. Workers gained no concessions. Many lost their jobs permanently. Those who returned to work at Pullman had to sign a pledge promising they would not join a union. The American Railway Union was shattered. It nearly dissolved. But history has a long arc. If you step back, you can see how defeats like this shape the ground for the next struggle, and sometimes, that next struggle leads to better outcomes. Whether George Pullman would have ever softened his stance is something we'll never know. A few years after the strike, he suffered a heart attack and died in his Prairie Avenue mansion at age 66. He was a man who believed he had done good, who had been successful his entire life, only to discover that the rules of the game had changed. He was widely criticized for being inflexible, insufferable even, for refusing to resolve the strike sooner by compromising. The principles that had guided him to success earlier in life no longer worked in this new era. After his death, the Illinois Attorney General sued the Pullman Company over its right to own and operate the town. The Illinois Supreme Court ordered the company to sell off everything except the factories. Residents were given the first opportunity to buy their homes, and many did. For the next 5 decades, employees continued trying to organize, though without success. Meanwhile, under new leadership, the Pullman Company shifted from building wooden railcars to steel ones. It continued innovating, adding electricity, improving ventilation, and strengthening safety standards. By 1900, on any given day, 100,000 people around the world were riding in a Pullman car. It was, in effect, the largest hotel in the world. As more passengers filled Pullman cars, the company expanded its onboard service staff. By the early 1920s, nearly 10,000 porters and maids were employed by Pullman. Many were descendants of enslaved people and sharecroppers who had moved north seeking opportunity. "My dad was born in Lynchburg, South Carolina," one son recalled. Humble beginnings. His father was a sharecropper and wanted him to do the same. But my father wasn't having that. He left South Carolina and hitchhiked to Baltimore. He was looking for a better life. Oscar James Webb Sr., father of Oscar James Webb Jr., was born in Monroe, Georgia, and later migrated to Chicago, like many young black men of that time. Men like Troy F. Briley and Oscar Webb found work as Pullman porters. They were polished, professional, and trustworthy. Their shoes shined. Their hats gleamed. They looked the part. That appearance gave them pride and respect within their communities. People would line up almost like it was a parade just to watch them return home. They carried leather doctor-style bags, often filled with tips they had earned traveling from state to state. "My father would be on the road 4 or 5 days at a time," one son said. "Chicago to San Francisco to New York and back again. He always had candy. He'd give kids a sucker and tell them to tell their parents the porter gave it to them, and then those parents would tip him. He might leave home with little, but he returned with cash in his pockets." While their base wages were low, tips sometimes allowed porters to earn more than many other black workers at the time. It offered a chance to improve not just their own standing, but their families as well. The onboard team made Pullman's Hotel on Wheels feel truly first class. Their smiling faces were featured prominently in company advertisements. Yet the Pullman Company never saw its porters and maids, or its African American employees, as equals. It failed to acknowledge them as the skilled, essential workforce they truly were. Porters often worked 20-hour shifts, several days in a row. They were away from home for long stretches and sometimes slept in the smoking car, getting as little as 3 hours of rest a night. In the 1982 film Miles of Smiles, Years of Struggle, former porters described their experience. "You try to sleep at night, and somebody would leave the door open. All night long it would slam, slam, slam. You couldn't get any rest. The work was exhausting. Long hours. Constantly at the beck and call of white passengers. They often had to buy their own shoe shine kits, their own towels, their own supplies. Some managed to earn a decent living, but it was always uncertain, dependent on tips. And beyond the grueling conditions, they faced open racism from passengers. They had to accept it with a smile, one man said. "If I go back there and create a problem, I'm just as foolish as he is. So I ignore it." If they talked back, they risked being thrown off the train in whatever city they happened to be in. Just as enslaved people had once been named after their masters, Pullman porters were routinely called George, after George Pullman himself. It was a subtle but powerful form of dehumanization. There was another layer to it all, the idea that these men weren't skilled professionals at all, just replaceable cogs in a machine. That they existed only to provide subservient service. That they didn't need to be recognized as human beings, or even as individuals. You either accept it or you reject it, one porter said. It depends on what kind of person you are. I accepted it, but of course I didn't like it. What can you do? In the 1920s, the Pullman Company employed more black workers than any other corporation in the United States. As the workforce grew, so did its influence. Pullman porters played a major role in advancing black culture. They carried black newspapers, like the Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier, to nearly every corner of the country. Those newspapers made the North come alive in the imaginations of many black Southerners. Through their pages, readers learned about protests, opportunities, and civil rights efforts happening in cities like Chicago and New York. They could feel connected to movements unfolding far from home. In many ways, Pullman porters were planting the seeds of civil rights activism. Sometimes they would toss newspapers off the back of trains. Word would spread, especially among young people, about where to retrieve them. The papers would then be taken back to neighborhoods, stores, and churches, shared and read aloud. It was an early 20th century social network, linking African Americans across the country. It also connected the porters to one another. As they read about workers standing up to employers, their own sense of power began to grow. They started to understand the strength of a collective voice. They began organizing. Chicago employed the largest number of Pullman porters. It was also the center of labor unrest. The city was a boiling pot, full of conflict, hostility, and uncertainty. Two competing classes were taking shape. Strike activity was increasing. Railroad unions were active. Steel workers were organizing. Stockyard workers attempted strikes. Pullman workers kept pressing the company about pay and working conditions. In response, the company created what it called a company union, the Employee Representation Plan. On paper, it offered social perks, softball teams, singing groups, community activities. But it didn't negotiate contracts. It didn't address real concerns. It didn't tackle the need for adequate sleep. It didn't address reimbursement for supplies like shoe polish and brushes that porters had to buy themselves. It didn't provide a legitimate wage independent of tips. None of that was included. The porters understood that if they wanted meaningful change, they would have to organize independently, carefully, strategically, and quietly. Losing a job could devastate an entire family. In 1917, away from company management's watchful eye, porters began circulating a monthly magazine called The Messenger. It was created by A. Philip Randolph, a labor activist sympathetic to their cause. The Messenger was radical for its time. Randolph focused heavily on class issues and economic justice. He believed that true citizenship required economic independence, that you could not be fully American if your opportunities were restricted by your skin color. He saw clearly how racial inequality was tied directly to economic power. The magazine campaigned against lynching. It called for integration. It encouraged readers to join black unions. Randolph argued that fair treatment of black workers was inseparable from a broader commitment to equal justice. Social justice, he said, could not exist without economic opportunity and civil rights. In its pages, Randolph even criticized Robert Todd Lincoln, son of Abraham Lincoln, who had become president of the Pullman Company. He wrote that it was deeply ironic for Robert Todd Lincoln to invoke his father's legacy. Abraham Lincoln had freed enslaved people from economic exploitation. Yet his son, Randolph argued, had lent his name to the exploitation of black workers as Pullman slaves. The U.S. Attorney General once called A. Philip Randolph the most dangerous Negro in the United States, not because of violence, but because of his ability to awaken and mobilize people. Randolph was bold. He wasn't afraid to challenge powerful institutions. And he wasn't intimidated by the Pullman Company. The porters believed he was exactly the leader they needed. Randolph was a socialist labor activist, fiery, intelligent, and an exceptional orator. Through his writing and advocacy, he proved he was willing to fight for black workers and challenge the status quo. He spoke to the porters about dignity. You have to stand up for yourselves, he told them. You can't let people walk over you. When they saw how he looked at them, not as servants, but as men deserving respect, they knew he was the one. Randolph agreed to lead their union. They called it the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Their grievances were long-standing. Their demands were clear: fair wages, more rest time on trains, respect, and no longer being called George. They wanted to be addressed by their actual names. By 1925, the Pullman Company employed around 12,000 porters. Randolph aimed to organize as many as possible. There was strength in numbers. He was advised early on that if he wanted porters' support, he needed the backing of Milton Webster, a former Pullman porter and respected community organizer. Webster established the Brotherhood's first local office in Chicago and became vice president of the union. He and Randolph complemented each other well. Randolph was the intellectual visionary, Webster was the practical strategist. Pullman maids also played a role in early organizing efforts. Webster, by many accounts, was not initially supportive of women working in such roles. Randolph, however, insisted that women be included in the union. Although they were outnumbered by porters, the maids were granted full union membership and voting rights. Porters' wives and daughters were equally crucial. They formed the Ladies' Auxiliary, an organized network that raised funds, hosted events, and spread the word about the Brotherhood. The auxiliary organized rallies, educated the public about labor rights, and even cooked meals for Randolph as he traveled the country meeting with porters. "My mother was involved in the Ladies' Auxiliary," one son recalled. "Often we don't give women the credit they deserve. She was the woman behind the man." The women were not just supporters. They were organizers, fundraisers, educators, and the backbone of the movement. The Ladies' Auxiliary really was the Brotherhood's secret weapon. They raised money for the men. They organized for them. They kept the movement alive behind the scenes. At the same time, the Brotherhood was promoting manhood rights. Randolph understood and appreciated what was then called the New Negro Woman, a woman who was independent, politically savvy, and fully aware that the race problem was something both men and women had to confront together. Now, Randolph's vision of the perfect future and black women's vision of the perfect future may not have been identical. Within the Brotherhood, gender equality was often seen as something that would follow racial equality. Black Americans wanted the same things that white citizens possessed, all of their rights. They wanted no reservations. They wanted complete equality, social, economic, and political. Philip Randolph was a wonderful man with a huge voice, tall, stately, and simply wonderful to be around. He exuded brilliance when he spoke. And no force under the sun can stem and block and stop this civil rights revolution which is now underway. Randolph and the Brotherhood traveled across the country preaching their message of fair treatment and fair wages. In cities where Pullman had a strong presence, Oakland, St. Louis, Baltimore, New York, meetings were kept quiet out of fear of company retaliation. By 1927, there were Brotherhood locals in more than 20 cities. Chicago's was the largest. The Brotherhood took direct aim at the Pullman Company's employee representation plan, calling it a sheer mockery. Black workers who aligned themselves with those company unions often found that no one was truly advocating for them. Those unions were advocating for the company, not the workers. Porters and maids began leaving the company union and joining the Brotherhood. The underground movement spread by word of mouth. Within the first year, Randolph and union leadership recruited more than 7,000 members nationwide. As the union grew stronger, from Oakland to Baltimore, company executives began to fear that Randolph was turning their workforce against them. So they tried to stop him. The Pullman Company offered Randolph a bribe, a blank check. They told him he could fill it out for up to 6 figures. Now imagine 6 figures during that time. That was an enormous amount of money. And they made it clear, this is how important it is for you to stop what you're doing. Randolph's response became legendary: black people's dignity is not for sale. He refused the check and sent it back. That act created a groundswell of respect for him in the community. Still, while many porters joined the Brotherhood in droves, others were afraid. The Pullman Company was powerful, and it flexed that power through spies, intimidation, and propaganda. Porters who openly supported the union were routinely fired. Fear tactics caused some men to turn against their own brothers. There were snitches, spies who infiltrated meetings. When word got back to the company about who had attended or spoken up, lists would appear. People would lose their jobs. Surprisingly, some of the strongest resistance to the Brotherhood came from within the black community itself. With its massive profits, the Pullman Company donated thousands of dollars to major black institutions like the Chicago Defender and the AME Church. In return, those institutions withheld public support of the union. It was a form of welfare capitalism, company owners giving money to black churches and ministers to preach against organized labor. In response, the Brotherhood found an ally in Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells brought together the AME Church and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. She used her relationships and influence to connect these organizations. Her support gave the movement moral authority and legitimacy that other union efforts did not have. With backing from the black community, membership rose to more than half of the porters employed by Pullman. Meanwhile, Randolph and the Brotherhood brought their case to the federal government. They pointed to legal precedent in a similar case involving white conductors. Both porters and conductors were demanding higher wages, provisions for sleep on the road, and better working conditions. The conductors had won most of those demands. Randolph argued that there was no real distinction between the two groups. They worked on the same trains. They worked the same hours. They performed the same duties. They were employed by the same employer. The only clear difference was race. The Pullman Company refused to recognize the Brotherhood as a legitimate union, claiming the workers were already covered under its company union. The government declined to intervene, a position it maintained through at least 4 appeals. By 1928, many Brotherhood members were losing faith. Then came the stock market crash. The Great Depression made everything worse. It was a tense time. Men who depended on these jobs to support their families didn't want to risk losing them. The Pullman Company knew that and threatened to replace union supporters with scabs. Brotherhood members later referred to this period as the Dark Days. The Great Depression left half of the country's African Americans unemployed. The Pullman Company furloughed nearly all of the maids, labeling them non-essential. It fired thousands of porters. Many who kept their jobs abandoned the Brotherhood, clinging to the work they had. They knew it would be nearly impossible to find employment elsewhere. If we lose our foothold here, we may have to go back to Mississippi. And we don't want to go back to Mississippi. Our children can't go to school in Mississippi. I can't be a man in Mississippi. My wife can't be safe there. Her black body cannot be protected in Mississippi because I have no rights there. So I'm not going to rock the boat, I have too much to lose here. Then, in 1932, everything shifted. It looks, my friends, like a real landslide this time. The country elected its 32nd president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Happiness lies not in the mere possession of money, it lies in the joy of achievement, in the thrill of creative effort. The joy, the moral stimulation, of work. In his first 100 days in office, Roosevelt signed more than a dozen major bills into law. Among them was the National Industrial Recovery Act, which guaranteed collective bargaining rights to workers. He also signed the National Labor Relations Act, which outlawed company unions that failed to provide workers with independent bargaining power. Private enterprise in times such as these cannot be left without assistance and without reasonable safeguard, lest it destroy not only itself but also our processes of civilization. Roosevelt was a friend to labor, and A. Philip Randolph recognized the opportunity. Randolph understood how power worked in America. He knew that as powerful as the George Pullmans of the world were, there were people even more powerful, the President of the United States and the political class in Washington. So he began joining forces with other labor groups, preparing for the next stage of the fight. A. Philip Randolph and the Brotherhood's leadership went to Congress and lobbied to be recognized as the official union representing the porters. This time, the government responded. New legislation protected the porters' right to organize. They were finally able to form a legitimate counter-union to the company unions and hold a vote so workers could decide who they wanted to represent them. The Pullman Company could no longer claim that its company union, the Employee Representation Plan, had authority over the porters. The Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters became an official charter of the American Federation of Labor. For the first time in United States history, there was a black labor union. On August 25, 1937, 12 years after the Brotherhood began its fight, they signed the first agreement between a union of African American workers and a major U.S. corporation. That's how change happens. You organize. You meet. And then you negotiate. The agreement brought higher wages, a cap on monthly working hours, and better job security. Pullman porters were no longer treated like pieces of machinery. They were recognized as men of respect and men of dignity. In the decades that followed, the Brotherhood and the Ladies' Auxiliary became major forces in the civil rights movement. Through their work with Randolph and the Union, they learned how to organize and advocate effectively. The black freedom struggle was shaped by black organized laborers who understood that something better was possible. The fight for racial justice and the fight for economic justice were, and are, completely and totally linked. Some of the most important moments of the civil rights era were directly influenced by the Brotherhood and its members. Rosa Parks, for example, worked as secretary for E.D. Nixon. Nixon was the local president of the NAACP, and he was also a former Pullman porter who led the Brotherhood's Montgomery chapter. When Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her bus seat, Nixon drew inspiration from his mentor, A. Philip Randolph. He tapped into his network and organized. Through phone banking, they raised $72,000, money that helped fuel the Montgomery bus boycott and secure Parks' release from jail. The union also helped shape other historic leaders, including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Randolph served as a mentor to King, helping him understand the power of sit-ins, strikes, and boycotts, strategies that became central to the fight against Jim Crow in the 1940s, 50s, and early 60s. In 1963, 250,000 demonstrators gathered in Washington, D.C., to demand civil rights. Randolph and the Brotherhood had been planning the March on Washington for 2 decades. Randolph stood before the crowd and reminded them that Black Americans were fighting to move from second-class to first-class citizenship, and that white allies were marching arm in arm with them. He delivered a powerful speech before introducing Dr. King. He made it clear, the March on Washington was not the climax of the struggle, it was a new beginning. Not just for Black Americans, but for all Americans who wanted a better life. When Dr. King delivered his historic speech in Washington, it stood on the foundation built by A. Philip Randolph and the Pullman Porters. Randolph's achievements, for his members, for workers, and for America, were immense. His efforts helped make the country more democratic and more egalitarian. Few labor leaders have had such a profound impact on the nation. Without A. Philip Randolph and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, there likely would not have been a modern civil rights movement. Many historians also credit the Brotherhood with helping create America's black middle class. The union made it possible for families to earn steady incomes, buy homes, and send their children to college, creating opportunities that echoed across generations. The descendants of Pullman porters include some of the most prominent African Americans in U.S. history, from former San Francisco Mayor Willie Brown to comedian Whoopi Goldberg to former First Lady Michelle Obama. Many descendants speak with pride about their fathers and grandfathers, men who stayed, fought, and demanded what they believed they deserved. In Baltimore, Porter Troy F. Braley ran his local Brotherhood office for 3 decades after the first contract was signed. He continued pushing for better conditions. In one 1955 letter, he argued there was no reason porters should be forced to sleep in the poor conditions described at the time. Braley later became national vice president of the Afro-American Labor Council and eventually ran for public office. He was elected to the Maryland House of Delegates in 1965 and passed several labor-related bills for the state. Chicago porter O.J. Webb had 10 children, many of whom went on to careers in public service. His son, Oscar J. Webb Jr., became a Goodwill ambassador for the United Nations, known for his ability to connect with people across the globe. He often said his success came from his father, a people person who taught him how to reach others. The legacy of the Pullman story stretches far beyond the Union itself. After the Pullman strike of 1894, President Grover Cleveland declared September 5 Labor Day in an effort to ease tensions with workers, a holiday Americans still celebrate today. In that sense, George Pullman's story helped bring about a national day honoring the working class. The town of Pullman was annexed into Chicago in 1889. In the 1930s, federal minimum wage laws and broader labor reforms made homeownership more accessible for Pullman employees and working-class Americans. The Pullman neighborhood remains a living reminder of a defining chapter in labor history in Chicago's past. In 2015, President Barack Obama designated Pullman as a national monument. Pullman tells the story of America. It reflects class, the tension between capital and labor. It reflects race. It reflects gender. It reflects immigration. All of these stories intersect there. And that is why Pullman is not just a local history. It is the story of America itself.